Recently, Anna Kasparian of the Young Turks broke her silence about former co-worker Dave Rubin and spoke in a pair of scathing videos where she not only roasted Dave Rubin to a crisp for his bad interview style and lack of intellectual stature, but she also trashed his more ridiculous libertarian ideas like getting rid of building regulations. Roaming Millenial took exception to Kasparian's commentary and shot back with her own response video, indignant on Rubin's behalf. Roman presents a lengthy description of hers, and similarly Rubin's, interview style as
being curious about something or someone and wanting to know more about it or them necessitates that you be on the opposition the entire time and constantly refuting any wrong thing they're spewing lest you be deemed complicit in their heresy is ridiculous, and it's a viewpoint that I've heard more than enough times in response to my own interviews. You see, I, like Dave, appreciate interviews where I get to learn more about the person being interviewed. Hopefully that includes questions they've never been asked before, questions that will help the audience learn something new about them and better understand their worldview, right? Because I feel like if I'm interviewing someone or if I'm watching an interview someone's given, whether I agree with them or not, I want to hear their perspectives, not the interviewers. And that's not to say that I don't like discussions or debates, formats where there's more of a give and take between both sides. That can be useful too, of course. But at the end of the day, if you do just want to understand someone, then yeah, listening to them is really the best way to go about it.
So let's be upfront and clear about one thing. Rubin is very bad at interviewing. While there's some definite pluses to letting an interview subject express themselves, there's a real problem when an interviewer comes into a lengthy interview having done so little homework that they let their subject dance around talking points that cover up a hidden agenda. When this happens, you go from being an interviewer who sheds light onto a subject to one who is complicit in helping obfuscate it. Using the example of Milo Yiannopoulos given by Kasparian, she quite rightly highlights how Rubin offers no resistance to Yiannopoulos' usage of tired race-realist talking points. When someone starts talking about IQ and race or religion, that should be a signal to an interviewer that this person may have a hidden agenda. These are the talking points often used by racists to present their essentialist ideas of race as a pseudoscientific basis for discrimination. The fact that Rubin was completely unaware of this, and worse, had no idea that this is the sort of garbage Yiannopoulos peddles, is especially embarrassing. His strategy of,
I don't even know where to start with that, so just go.
"Oh, but Romy noticed that," is shameful. Any half-decent interviewer should have had at least some follow-up questions to these supposed scientific facts. I'll have some examples of those later on. But wait, this wasn't even the entirety of the point Kasparian was making. There's a much more serious charge of Rubin not fact-checking.
Whoa, Anna didn't say she's against interviewing certain figures, only that people have a responsibility to correct factual errors when they are presented by people on their platform. That's not being anti-interview, right? Well, sure, that may be what Anna said, but is that what she meant? Based on this next clip, it seems like no, it's really not.
Wow, what a dodge. But Roman had a reason to dodge that, and it has to do with this clip of Kasparian venting about Rubin.
But the reason why I have such a huge problem with Dave Rubin is because he's had Milo Yiannopoulos on his show twice, hour-long interviews, and Milo was able to say whatever he wanted to say without any pushback from Dave Rubin, including anti-Semitic remarks.
So I covered this a few moments ago, but did Kasparian bring this out as evidence of her accusation that Rubin lets people tell lies in his interviews? Aside from the deceptive nature of Yiannopoulos' comments, this clip is actually in the context of a larger story where the Rubin outburst came from. If you bother to watch the first few minutes of the video, you'll see Kasparian's comments come in the context of a story about Yiannopoulos, where he had commented to a journalist, rather blithely, about journalists being murdered in the streets. The two IT hosts go on to rightfully describe the game Yiannopoulos plays, posing as a legitimately concerned voice from the mainstream right, while surreptitiously fueling a more extreme position with his subversive talking points, such as sneaking race realism, aka racism, into his interviews. This is the context in which Rubin is being criticized for platforming someone and being completely unprepared to counter their noxious talking points. This is what makes him a bad interviewer. But to look at things more closely, here's how Romain presented the clip.
Not in debate. It's a statistical fact. You know, Jews are on most of the banks. Jews completely dominate the media, vastly disproportionately represented in all of these professions. That's just a fact. It's not anti-Semitic to point out statistics.
Dave Rubin sells it as, I'm far more intellectual, and as a result, I refuse to engage in a debate or an argument. I allow people to make their case on my show. No, you're lazy.
And here's the original video.
This is not in debate. It's a statistical fact. You know, Jews are on most of the banks. Jews completely dominate the media, vastly disproportionately represented in all of these professions. That's just a fact. It's not anti-Semitic to point out statistics. But you know, you seem to have you've missed what you agree with me on feminism. Like, it's not sexist to point out statistics. I'm suggesting to you, it's not anti-Semitic to point out that these things are true. Now, the anti-Semitism on the internet.
Okay, that's not remotely true. That's not a stat. That's not a fact. And if you want to see how someone challenges that deeply anti-Semitic trope, watch my interview with David Duke, where I shred him. And every time he mentions a Jewish banker, I mention a non-Jewish banker. Why? Because I actually bothered to do my homework. And I know that David Duke is a monster, and that if you're going to have a discussion with him, you have to actually rebut what he says, and you have to come with actual facts. And what does Dave Rubin do? I don't know what to say about that. Just go.
No, it's actually worse than that. Dave Rubin sells it as, I'm far more intellectual, and as a result, I refuse to engage in a debate or an argument. I allow people to make their case on my show. No, you're lazy.
Oh, would you look at that? There was a whole section from Cenk Uygur about how Yiannopoulos didn't cite any real statistics to back up his supposed fact. I wonder why Rubin didn't want to address this point. Asking your interview subject for a source for their information is, quite possibly, one of the most basic questions an interviewer can ask. If you're interviewing someone and they say something like, I have a purple elephant that lives in my attic, wouldn't you ask for some evidence of that? But if someone is talking about the Jews and how they have disproportionate power and influence, suddenly a follow-up question for evidence is somehow construed as trying to virtue signal or trap someone to a progressive narrative. It's almost as if there are some inherent assumptions about the Jewish people that Rubin is bringing to her analysis. It's not even necessarily that Rubin is a believer in the whole nonsensical Jewish dominance conspiracy, but by not observing that this is something that's trying to be smuggled into the discourse, she's certainly an enabler. Rubin continues on a lengthy diatribe proving how she doesn't understand at all the idea of using statistics as a backdoor for sneaking in bigotry. Here's a simple example to make the point more salient. In the 16th century, the literacy rates of England were abysmal. This graph here represents just how many people were illiterate in England. 90% of men and 100% of women. Using the logic of a race realist, or in this case perhaps a literacy realist, a dry reading of the stats would lead you to believe that the vast majority of human beings are not capable of being literate, and women in particular are not as literate as men, perhaps not capable of literacy at all. But if we follow this graph through the centuries, we see the literacy rates not only plummet, but men and women reach a parity at the beginning of the 20th century. It doesn't take any real brain power to figure out that access to education dramatically increased literacy rates among the population, and changing attitudes towards women gave them greater access to education. But what about the proposition by the literacy realist that human beings generally can't be literate and that women are worse than men? Time has revealed that person to be, at best, uninformed, and at worst, a bigot in disguise. That's the problem with someone with an agenda citing neutral statistics, and why it's important to be vigilant against anyone who tries to sneak this sort of toxic thinking into discourse. It's also something that Rubin and Rubin fail at spectacularly. Rubin goes from defending Rubin to defending the alt-right and Yiannopoulos in a strange way, claiming that back in those naive days of 2016,
back then, the alt-right as a term and movement was much more ambiguous than it is currently, and people, including Milo, were using it to mean what's referred to now as the new right. The alt-right wasn't inherently and always about white nationalism like it is now.
Of course, when Yiannopoulos wrote a big article that served as a guide to the alt-right, he consulted with actual white nationalists to get the message out, as revealed in this report by BuzzFeed News. So yeah, Rubin, it was always there, and Yiannopoulos helped put it there.
But if you follow the Rubin Report at all, you'll know that Dave actually gets a variety of guests on. Left-wingers, right-wingers, atheists, Christians, Muslims, ex-Muslims. In fact, the only thing most of the people on his show have in common is that they're free speech supporters most of the time.
This is rich. Rubin rarely ever has a left-wing guest on, and when he does, he brings them on to bash the left. In fact, this left bashing, more than free expression, is what animates Rubin's guest list, and his audience too, by the way. His entire show is fueled by anti-left hatred, and what that does is move its audience to the right. I went into great detail on how this works in another video of mine, which is worth a watch if you have 40 minutes to spare. You can also see this in the topics Rubin covers, as he's on top of any confrontation on a university campus, but he's silent when it comes to the President of the United States attacking the press. Next, Rubin claims Kasparian is attacking Rubin as a person and not going after his ideas.
What really bothers me in political discourse is when people choose to attack you personally instead of going after your ideas, your policies, your content, whatever it may be. And based on these videos, that seems to be exactly what Anna's MO is.
Of course, she later goes on to say,
Now, after that clip in the video, Anna does go into some substantive criticisms about Dave's positions as a libertarian, and she uses examples of him talking about the post office and building regulations specifically. I'm not going to go into that.
So I guess we're getting a bit of both here? Maybe Rubin is so upset about the personal attacks, her language got muddled. Anyway, let's look at some of these personal attacks as highlighted by Rubin.
He has partnered with Learn Liberty, which is funded by the Koch brothers, in addition to Prager University, and boom, he's suddenly a libertarian thinker. My accusations about him being lazy are evident in his lack of intellectual curiosity, which translates to a level of ignorance on a wide variety of issues.
This isn't just an ad hominem, as Kasparian clearly explains her motivations in doing this when she says,
Consider the fact that Dave Rubin is a public figure who represents you, and he doesn't actually genuinely believe in your ideology.
What Kasparian is saying is that Rubin's views are disingenuous and that his change of heart is driven by money, and this explains his lazy interview style and shameless platforming of libertarian voices. If I were interviewing Roman Millenial, I'd probably ask a follow-up question right here about her claim that Kasparian is using an ad hominem. Roman, if you're claiming Anna Kasparian is using a cheap personal attack by saying Dave Rubin doesn't mean what he says, aren't you guilty of the same thing in this very video when you say this?
Well, sure, that may be what Anna said, but is that what she meant? Based on this next clip, it seems like no, it's really not.
And as another follow-up question, Roman, why are you so bad at this? But let's forget this terrible video and instead focus on one last point I'd like to raise, and I think it will shock everyone watching. I think Anna Kasparian got it wrong here on her point about the Koch funding. To clarify, the Koch brothers, or Charles Koch specifically via Learn Liberty, are absolutely influencing the Rubin Report by supplying Rubin with libertarian guests because, as Kasparian has helpfully pointed out,
He was lazy when he worked here, he's lazy now.
the money Rubin likely gets from them probably doesn't hurt either. But here's the important distinction we need to make. Rubin's partnership with Learn Liberty began in September of 2016, whereas Rubin's show, in its bobble-headed nodding along glory, began in September of 2015. It's a full year of shows Rubin produced before getting that Koch brother funding, and yes, that included the interview. That said, I don't doubt for a second that the Learn Liberty group knew exactly what they were buying into. Space on the platform from a very useful guy who, according to his former co-worker, isn't that bright or hardworking. There's one additional factor that I think is the missing piece in this puzzle, though, and where I disagree with Kasparian on the issue. I think Rubin is very easily manipulated. He's so easily manipulated that he's nothing more than an overseer for a show that's just a convenient platform for anti-left sentiment. I believe Rubin is genuine when he states his beliefs because he's not smart enough to see through how ridiculous the libertarian ideas he espouses are, and throughout that first year of his show you can see him slowly but surely being manipulated into those positions by his guests and audience alike. Here's a before and after clip.
They will say, you know what, we should pay $772 million in fines and restitution because we're regulating ourselves. I'm sure that would have happened, right?
Is there an example of self-regulation ever working? Really? I mean, has it ever worked? Doesn't it automatically go awry by definition?
When people fuck things up and short things and do things terrible, they're not thinking logically.
I think it's the government that they're like, the government gave me this regulation, so that's why I'm going to do it right.
If you're not going to have regulation, what is the solution if someone does something that's illegal?
Now everybody is walking around with Snapchat and Instagram and blah, blah, blah. So a lot of this stuff would be exposed more so that all of the things that we've been talking about for the last couple hours about people getting involved, a lot of the things I think would start self-regulating.
Did Rubin change his opinion for the money, or was he duped by cleverer people than him to change his mind? My guess is it's the latter. To be fair, it could be a bit of both, but I found the axiom of not blaming on malevolence what you can on stupidity very useful over the years. And how can we not see stupidity when we look at Dave Rubin?